Hey everyone. Vice President, I really appreciate your remarks because I am going to talk about the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, but in a different context. This talk is your team versus 130,000, and that's like the approximate number that I can come up with if you end up in the targeting set of the Chinese military. In instances involving the security services, that number may change given how high or low of a priority you are. This talk is probably at the beginning of the conference, just to give you something to go, oh yeah, this is why we care about cybersecurity, this is why we're here, and this is what we're concerned by. A simple question, one that if you know nothing about China, you can answer. One that if you've been in China for a year, maybe you can write a paragraph on, and if you've lived in China, you can maybe put together a sentence about what is China. Loosely, it's a state with 1.4 billion people, so more than 4 times the population of the United States. It's composed of 34 provincial and municipal governments spread all across the country, and including Hong Kong, but not Taiwan. You can quote me on that. It's got 90 million plus Communist Party members. This organization is both supranational in that it sits above the government, but it is also an organization unto itself, which is responsible for the organization of society. And all of these people, and all of these people in the Chinese Communist Party, have a common problem, which is that governing China, this country that is both large and full of so many people, is really difficult. They solve this problem by making public statements. This is often called slogan politics, and somebody will put something forward, they'll put quote marks around it, and they go, this is Xi Jinping's idea. And everyone will go, oh yeah, Xi Jinping said this, and so I'm going to do the following. And every time they talk about it, they mention some of these slogans. And this is a rough way of organizing information distribution in such a large country. But it makes understanding China, their targeting priorities, the way that they have organized their offensive hacking capabilities, easy to study. So China operates on 5-year plans. This is familiar to anybody familiar with communist regimes. China, no different than the rest of them. They have coarse-grained 5-year plans, which the central government releases. They say, by 2035, we're going to be the best in AI. And all of the people responsible for AI go, how are we going to get there? Then they put out their own finer grain 5-year plans. So these come a year later, and all of the experts have sat down and go, okay, if we're going to be the experts in AI by 2035, then by 2027 we need to do this, and by 2030 we need to do that. And then they put all of that documentation together in these documents that are put out by the ministries, by provincial governments, and by municipal governments. And again, this makes it very easy to understand, okay, Xi Jinping said this, these people want to do it this way, and this is how they're going about implementing it. We know this impacts the way that they make decisions because it shows up in their government evaluations. The document that you see behind me is an evaluation for municipal government officials in Guangzhou, which is in southern China. And you can see on that list how they're evaluated for GDP growth, commercialization of particular areas, etc. I particularly like this, though, which is about the acquisition of intellectual property rights. And the evaluations even state that you can get points as a local government official if the intellectual property being used by a particular company is received through transfer, gift, etc. Today, China is sitting in a languishing economy. Their youth unemployment, people between 18 and 35, is more than 40%, and that was the estimate we got before the Beijing University economics professor got taken off WeChat for making that information public. Youth unemployment is very high. They are in what they view as an existential competition with the United States for technological dominance. They think that every generation has the opportunity, if seized, to command technology's heights. And they believe that we are in an opportunity, one such period, in which they have the opportunity to seize the commanding heights of current technology. That's AI, the bioeconomy, quantum. If you put it on the NCSE top 5 targets list, they're the ones trying to go after it. That makes them very motivated. China's also done being the manufacturer of the world. Yes, they need full employment, but if you look at the profit margins on an iPhone that go to Apple, estimates range from 60 to 70%. Foxconn, the company assembling iPhones, is making single-digit profit margins. There is an incredible incentive to move up the value chain into the design and intellectual property production aspects of capitalism. That's exactly what they're pursuing. That puts us in this room, our clients, the people we interact with, critical infrastructure operators, into the bullseye for Chinese hacking teams. It incorporates many more organizations and companies than we had previously acknowledged. We've heard a lot about typhoons in the last 2 or 3 years: Salt Typhoon, Bolt Typhoon, Gingham Typhoon, etc. It's a naming convention. It's put out by Microsoft, not to belabor the point. And they have a wide variety of targets of interest. This is a rough heuristic of what Chinese hacking teams are interested in doing in any particular sector. Education, as we stand in a university, incredibly interesting, both a generator of intellectual property and public knowledge, but also a place where students who will go on to become future leaders in companies and in government are educated, influencing the people who work at universities, facilitating relationships with universities in China, et cetera. Those are things that don't show up on the strategic targets of hackers, but are no doubt a goal of the Chinese Communist Party. When we think about what typhoons are after, it's much easier for us to talk in plain language about the political institutions behind the typhoons. The military, what we have in common parlance, Volt Typhoon, right? You can map that to parts of the PLA, interest in disruption, the Ministry of State Security, many other smaller, unnamed threat actors, much more interested in economic espionage. One such case for how we end up with intellectual property theft out of China would look something like this. This document is from the China's Southern S&T Conversion Center, or S&T Achievement Center. And on the right-hand side, you can see where I've gone through and translated this request. There is a high-end technology company, and they have identified a need for self-driving vehicle technology. You can see the requirements in red on the right. This booklet is available online in some cases it's not. Depends on where you look. And it is full of 120 plus pages of requirements that companies need in order to achieve their growth objectives, right? So if you think back a couple slides to the local official who's being evaluated for GDP growth, this type of information is really important for companies to succeed and thus grow that economy so they can get those bonuses. So this is what the request looks like when a company might need a certain technology. China also has science and technology diplomats that are stationed abroad. A number of them were based in the Houston consulate. They've since left during the last administration. I think in 2021, we shut down that consulate. And they filled out documents like this. This is a document that an S&T bureaucrat would have filled out in facilitating the targeting of a particular technology, an individual, or other intellectual property rights generated by a university or a business. You can see here they go down the list, fill in the names, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. How are we going to get in touch with these people, though? What is the form of cooperation? The form asks. And there are interesting ways that you can indicate the interest of this foreign company or foreign individual in helping China develop. They are going abroad for technical training. Seems like a weird thing to highlight. You could just purchase the key know-how, or you could introduce unique resources, right? These are boxes on a form that a state employee checks after identifying who has access to technology of interest. If these forms of cooperation are not acceptable, there is, of course, going out, hacking, and collecting. So when we think about the actors behind, the political actors, behind the threat actors, the UNCs, the typhoons, the pandas, go down the list of naming conventions you want. They map, in many cases, to actual political organizations, and those are much easier to number. We estimate that there are approximately 19 bureaus of the Ministry of State Security. This is the Civilian Intelligence Service. There are around 5 technical reconnaissance bureaus for the Chinese military, the PLA, and there are around 13 PLA cyberspace force bureaus. In addition to that, there are 34 different provincial and municipal level MPS offices, or Ministry of Public Security. All of these organizations have an offensive hacking mission. They are not all a single APT. You may end up with multiple PLA bureaus being associated with multiple threat actors, and vice versa. This is how you get to the point where it's your team versus 130,000, and you get Christopher Wray, former head of the FBI, testifying before Congress that it is literally 1 versus 50. This is a rough mapping of some of the typhoons that I'm sure that you've heard about already. Bolt Typhoon, interested in U.S. critical infrastructure. Salt Typhoon, telecommunications, etc. Flax Typhoon, indicted by Department of Justice last year. You can take pictures of these slides. You don't have to worry about it. So, how many threat actors? At a minimum, from a political organization standpoint, there are 71 different organizations with an offensive mission in cyberspace from China. That does not include their subordinate offices, how many contractors they have. If you think about the people supplying technology and capabilities to these organizations, you get into the many hundreds of organizations. This document substantiates the title of this talk, Your Team versus 130,000. Yes, it's in Mandarin. I'm sorry in advance. If you can read the Mandarin, though, that top line indicates that the Taiwan Ministry of Defense estimates that in 4 of those 13 military support bureaus, there are approximately 70,000 individuals. This estimate is composite data from as late as 2021. We think that these numbers likely change. And so if you end up being in an industry, you have access to information, you have access to people that China cares about. This is how it becomes your security team versus 130,000 people. We used to think that prior to 2021, China was in its golden years. Anthem Insurance, Target, Google. Go down the list, everybody was getting hit by the Chinese. The reality is, China wasn't even good at this point in time. They hadn't figured out, as Vice President Grillo mentioned, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. One of the key things that Xi Jinping did when he came into office was revamp cybersecurity education, and they based it on the United States system. So he comes in 2013, he stands up a committee and says, cybersecurity policy, cybersecurity talent, this whole industry is going to be really important for the future. Stands up a leading small group that eventually becomes a standing committee of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you're thinking about a pyramid, these guys are like third rung in terms of importance. They create a bunch of bureaucratic mechanisms to actually enforce policy. They come up with the Cyberspace Administration of China, which has municipal and provincial bureaus across the country, responsible for implementing and promoting cybersecurity development. And this creates a demand signal. If you go back in your mind to the evaluation slide of local government officials, you can, on that document, somebody goes, did you implement the CAC policy on cybersecurity and informatization? They go, yep, I did that, and they fill in their document, and then they get the bonus points, right? Very straightforward process for creating incentives at the local level to implement central government policy. When Xi Jinping came into office, so again, a decade ago plus, the overarching mentality was hackers are like finding flowers in a field of wheat. It happens, it's by accident, they are beautiful when you find them, and you have to go looking really hard to find a bunch of them. And a bunch of really smart bureaucrats studied the US system and said, actually, no, the US is really good at harvesting a crop of cybersecurity talent, offensive and defensive. And so in 2015, Xi Jinping launches a review of cybersecurity degree curriculum in China. In 2016, they put out a national strategy. They literally build a national cybersecurity talent and innovation base in Wuhan. It's got 40 square kilometers of land, a national cybersecurity school, offensive and defensive research labs. It is truly an all-of-society approach to developing cybersecurity industry in one particular area. They also copy the US system for CAE, which is Centers of Academic Excellence in the United States. The National Security Agency, along with the Department of Homeland Security, both recognize certain US universities as CAE schools. China saw that and goes, I like that idea. We're going to do that also. And so they introduced world-class cybersecurity schools in 2017. And again, revamping that pipeline to improve the capability of their hackers. Finally, in 2018, the government gets tired of their best researchers going overseas, demonstrating 0 days at vulnerability competitions in the United States and Canada. And they put out a prohibition and say, you actually can't travel abroad to discuss these software vulnerabilities anymore. And in so doing, they build their own community of hacking competitions at home. We know that in 2018, they were also mandating the reporting of software vulnerabilities from those competitions into the government. We have their chat logs here from iSoon, the company that experienced a leak early last year, where they're talking about, hey, can I get that Ode from Tianfu? And they go, no, sorry, it was already passed to Jiangsu. So at this point, when these logs were created in 2021, it was already commonplace for people to know that vulnerabilities were making their way to the government from these competitions. And the number of these competitions has increased significantly. Both Ode competitions, yes, but more generally capture the flag competitions for education. The thing you need to do to practice your hands-on skills has increased significantly in China over the last decade. If you can make out the language on this slide, as I'm trying to see it back there, I'm realizing this is probably very difficult for you to read up here. I'll make this slide brief. Suffice to say, we were able to identify and put together a concept of how vulnerabilities move from the private sector into the Chinese government following the introduction of a law in 2021 requiring their reporting to the government. So the law says you have to give us the vulnerabilities to this left-hand side. It's the big circle. In that law, they also state, oh, those vulnerabilities, by the way, are going to make their way to the Ministry of Public Security's third bureau, which is up at the top. And then we're going to provide them to China CERT, the CNVD database. And in doing the research to put this together, if you look at who is receiving the vulnerabilities in that database, it is actually, in many cases, companies supporting the offensive services of the Ministry of State Security, so the Civilian Intelligence Service, or the Civilian Intelligence Service itself. And they made those membership lists publicly available. We know that if you're doing business in China, which is incredibly vague, you have 48 hours to tell the government of a software vulnerability when you become aware of it. They put a gag rule in place on researchers to say that if you become aware of a vulnerability, you discover a vulnerability, you can only tell the company, who has to tell us, or the government, us, or you can shut up about it, and that's it. You cannot publish a proof of concept code until a patch is available. If you do, fines are levied against you, etc. Your company is punished. Finally, China has spent a lot of time building places for their hacking teams to practice. Up on the slide, you can see the names of 5 different government-sponsored cyber ranges. When the US was developing Stuxnet for attacks on Iranian centrifuges, they relied on a cyber range to recreate their target environment, practice their attacks, and ensure that they work. You can imagine that these laboratories function in a similar capacity for the Chinese government. And so when we think about the offensive teams and their mission, the military, the intelligence services, the people who want to pre-position on US critical infrastructure, stop its function in the event of armed conflict, or the civilian intelligence services who go, I need to with the network reconnaissance I have, pull down the information. I want to recreate the target network, and I want to practice attacking that network before I actually go in and do it. That is exactly the function of Peng Chung Laboratory, which is in the top right-hand side. Other labs on this slide are facilitating the integration of industrial control systems, ICS systems, and IT networks for the express purpose of attacking and defending those industrial control systems. So I'm glad to have been able to speak with you today about these actors, the way that they think, why they are pursuing particular policies and what they've done up until this point. So we can talk about them here, and then we can defend against them out there. Thank you.